Well, hello and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 1 of The Last Battle by Cauldron Pool.
It's written by Cauldron Pool?
No, the name of the chapter is by Cauldron Pool.
Oh, by Cauldron Pool.
Yeah, the author is not Cauldron Pool. I'm not sure people know this. The author is C.S. Lewis, Clive Staples Lewis, known often as Jack Lewis.
Jack.
Yes.
Which is a natural nickname.
Well, welcome to Season 7, Phil.
This is it. This is the beginning of the end.
The beginning of the end here, the final book in the series. Hard to believe we've made it this far. Before we jump in, because we have a lot to talk about in this first chapter, can we just do a little bit of maybe housekeeping? As we've said many times before, a lot of people, if they find our show, later on after obviously it's aired or something, if you go into your most, what are they called? Like podcast catchers, podcatchers? Is that what they're called?
I'm not sure.
Sounds like
I'm not sure where this.
If you go into a podcast app, usually you'll see the first episode for any given season there. And so for a lot of people, this might be their first entry into the Lamppost Listener. What are some of the things that maybe people should be aware of, or that we can even remind people who've been listening for the last 5 years about?
We are novices. We're Narnia novices, but
Narnia novices.
We're about to graduate. After doing 7 seasons, I think
once we finish the series, yes.
Yeah, we'll get bumped up. So we are coming at this not as experts, but we are learning alongside our listeners.
Yes.
And oftentimes we learn from our listeners.
Sure.
People have been very kind in emailing us and giving us both feedback and answers to some of the questions that we've asked. We're still getting offers for Turkish Delight to be sent to either one of our...
Yeah, it always starts off with Phil and Daniel, what's your address? And that's just... We love our listeners. It's a weird way to start an email. We love you.
I don't even know
We're a little
Daniel's
worried
address.
when you... Well, Phil, one of the other things that's been the case for most of this show is that I have read these books before. I've not pored over them for years and years and years or anything like that. I have not studied them academically, but I'm relatively familiar with them. You, however, are reading this book, The Last Battle, for the very first time. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I was thinking about this when I picked up my trusty copy, which I think this is a combination of all 7 books in the wrong order.
No, not this book, though. In both chronological and publication order, this is the 7th book.
This book is the right order, but all the books together are in the chronological order that we do not agree with. But I was thinking we should auction this off. But my grandmother gave it to me in 6th grade, so I'm probably not going to do that. She wrote a nice little note. It's also kind of falling apart. But I remember in 6th grade, I carried this around because I wanted people to think that I read
this much,
a really big book, even though I don't even know if I opened it once or twice. I had a few of the books read to me, but yes, for the most part, I have never read these books before. I've now read 6 of them. And because of the way we prepare for the show, we read each chapter twice.
You've read, yes.
So I've really read it twice.
I don't think that's how it goes, but okay.
I know you don't, but it is. And for the 7th book, I'm going into this completely cold. You know how this ends.
I do.
But there's a phrase that for the past 6 seasons, I haven't known where it comes from.
Further up and further in.
And I read through the chapter list. And I now know that it is the title of the second to last chapter.
Yes.
So in just a few months' time, I will understand what everyone has been referring to for the past 5 years.
I also looked over the chapter list. So I just reread it recently, like in the last few months to prepare for the season. I reread the whole book. And I take that back. I reread everything, and I have 2 more chapters to go. So I was simultaneously, as we prepared for this episode, going back over and reading the first 2 chapters, in depth, taking notes, preparing for this episode, and then the next episode to record, which is chapter 2, and but also reading chapters 15 and 16 because I was trying to finish a full read through before, and I didn't finish it with enough time before we needed to prepare for these. So I'm on chapter 14 and chapter 1 all at the same time.
Yeah.
The one thing I also wanted to mention was as I looked through here, the chapter titles do not give away a lot, actually. You might get a chapter like here, chapter 7, mainly about dwarfs. You know very little about what's going to happen in that chapter, other than that it is mainly about dwarfs.
Which wasn't always the case. I feel like some of the chapters very much forecast what would happen.
Yeah, especially Magician's Nephew. We got a lot more of that. But here, Lewis wants to maybe be a little bit more closed off with his chapter titles. Well, Phil, I have a couple of things I want to chat about with the history of this book and some of its reception before we dive into our chapter summary and before we walk through chapter 1 here. So this book, as we mentioned before, each of these books beginning in 1950 is released annually. And so here with the 7th book, we have in 1956, this book is published, but actually, believe it or not, Lewis finished writing it in March of 1953. Oh, wow. 3 years before it's published, and actually before he had finished The Magician's Nephew, which I knew it was finished a couple years before it was published. I did not know that Magician's Nephew, which would come out earlier, was not finished when he finished writing the end of this entire Narnia story.
Interesting. Huh.
A couple other titles that he went through before deciding on The Last Battle was The Last King of Narnia and Night Falls on Narnia. And Night Falls on Narnia he ended up using for chapter 14's title. So he did keep that name.
On page 749.
Yes. The book actually, in 1956, it won the Carnegie Medal for Best Children's Literature, and I thought you would really appreciate this as an illustrator yourself. Pauline Baines wrote a letter to congratulate Lewis, saying, "Hey, congratulations! This final book in this series has won this big award."
And he wrote back, "You still can't draw lines."
Yeah, and he responded with "No thanks to you. I still think you're terrible." No, he actually was very kind to her here. Lewis wrote, and here's the words: "Is it not rather our medal? I'm sure the illustrations were taken into consideration as well as the text."
Yes.
So that was really kind of him.
Way to go, Clive.
Yeah, saying that, back here in season 1, we mentioned that Lewis said that she was really terrible at drawing lions. So I guess, I don't know.
Which I disagree with. I feel like they're actually...
Yeah, I think they look fine. I'm trying to remember now, having just reread it, how maybe there were not nearly as many illustrations of lions in this so far, because here in chapter 1, there's an illustration of a donkey as a lion, but not a lion itself. And I don't remember if we actually see a lion in any of the illustrations. So maybe that's why Lewis thought she did a good job. He's like, your lion looks really bad, but it's okay because it's supposed to look bad because it's on a donkey. So that's what he was...
Also, let's see your lion.
Well, this might be a surprise to you. It won't be a surprise to many of our listeners who have read this book before or have just kind of talked to other people about it. This is, without a doubt, in my opinion, the most controversial of the books when it comes to its narrative itself. There are a lot of people who would rank this as their favorite Narnia book. There's many people who would say it's their least favorite. I wanted to actually share a couple of things with you about this book and actually try to get some of your thoughts as someone who's never read this before as to what might be going on. So Walter Hooper, who we've mentioned on the show before, we did a whole episode. It's been a little over 2 years since he passed away back in 2020. He wrote in his book, Past Watchful Dragons, about The Last Battle, and he said this about the book. He writes that The Last Battle is the best written and most sublime of all Narnia stories, the crowning achievement of the whole Narnian creation. Everything else in all the other 6 stories finds its ultimate meaning in relation to this book. Wow, from Walter Hooper himself, the most important book in the series. Interesting. Then just talking to... I've been teaching this Lewis class for the last few years. So I've been talking a lot with Lewis, with other adults. I've been teaching it in classrooms for many years. And just speaking, in these conversations, I found some people that really dislike this book, some people who do just really like it. All this is anecdotal, obviously. And so I went to one place that is not anecdotal, and that is goodreads.com. and so I think I've gone on the show before to say, not a big fan of Goodreads and not a big fan of just anyone being able to slop a little review on something. And just the one with the most likes all of a sudden becomes, I know that's often how social media works. This is why I do not like social media. I wanted to just pick a couple of the top ones here and read them to you. I took out ones that might be a little spoilery for right now, just to get you an idea of some visceral reactions that people have had.
Okay.
Again, these are ones that all came off the front page of The Last Battle's Goodreads. Here you go. First one. I think this is the first book I've ever hated.
Wow.
The next one I found was one of the next ones I found was a dismayingly poor conclusion to the series. Another writer wrote, Lewis understands the way the world works better than any other writer I've ever read. It's likely due to his appreciation for story and powerful imagination fed by scripture. Going on, here you go. Nice short one. 1 star, worst ending ever. And another one I got, what a fitting end to such an epic series.
Next, we should do some Amazon reviews where 1 star, good book, but arrived damaged.
It's like, yeah, you give the, yeah.
I understand why people write that. I don't understand why those reviews remain 8 years later.
Yeah, say, okay, great. Like, take that review off, please.
Yeah,
you know,
or just nudge it down. It shouldn't be the top thing.
Exactly. So, obviously, Phil, you're hearing that there's a little bit of a reaction. You might say that this book is maybe, and this is not something we ever talk about much on the show, but this book might be like the Last Jedi of the Narnia books, in that there are some people who really love it. They love what Lewis is doing, and some people who feel like it tramples on the last 6 books, everything that came before it. And so it'll be interesting as we go through this to talk through maybe why some people might feel that way. What are things? I mean, what are your reactions to this? Now, our goal in doing this podcast has never been to just talk about what we think about the books. No, that's not at all. It's to enjoy these books and enjoy Lewis and what he is saying, not what you and I are saying about what Lewis is saying. Right. This is not that kind of meta podcast. We try to have a more synthetic approach and a less analytical approach. Okay. But just hearing that, I mean, are you surprised to learn that there's a lot of people who were frustrated with this book?
It must be difficult to end a series. We haven't read Game of Thrones, but I think Game of Thrones, the part of the reason that he hasn't finished it is there's a lot of pressure. A lot of people are expecting a certain ending, and you're not going to be able to please everybody. Everyone at this point is now imagining what the ending is going to be, and I think that you have 6 really successful books that are really dear to people's hearts, and now you're going to end the series. It's just going to be difficult. Can you think of series that have ended really well?
Yeah, it's hard to think of a book series that has an ending that I absolutely love outside of, I'll put my cards on the table, outside of the Chronicles of Narnia. I love the ending of this book. I'm not talking necessarily even about the ending of the book itself. I love the last battle as an ending in its, as a whole. Mm-hmm. It's hard to think of one. It's hard to think of a series of books that I've read where I've gotten to the end and absolutely loved it. I know some people are going to say Tolkien. I think that's unfair because The Lord of the Rings is one book.
Right. I thought you would bring that up.
It's a great ending, but it's not 3 separate stories. It's
I feel
one
like that's
story.
one really nice story that was printed in 3 volumes of.
Yeah, exactly. So
I would 6 books.
I wouldn't count that. I'm having a hard time thinking of something. I have not read, and obviously another big one out there we talked about before is Harry Potter. I have not read The Deathly Hallows since that book came out. Right. I went to Barnes & Noble. I read it in, a day or two.
I feel like we both read the first 5 multiple times. I certainly read the first one like 7 or 8 times.
What I would do as a kid, because like every kid, who was born in the 90s, I loved Harry Potter as a middle schooler, late elementary schooler. And as each new book would come out, I would reread all the books, right? So like I remember going when, Order of Phoenix comes out, and I'd read 1 through 4, and then the 6th book come out, I'd read 1 through 5 again.
Yeah.
The 7th book came out, I read 1 through 6 again, read 7. Well, I never needed to reread them again because there weren't any new ones coming out. And right. I think I was a freshman in high school when the last one came out. And yeah, I've never really returned to the books since then. Yeah. I didn't remember disliking the ending. I don't remember also thinking it ended on a high point. I kind of had felt like it had started to fall apart a little bit. Not significantly where I would say it's a bad ending.
There's also something about the number 3. I think that we have stuff that's in 3 acts, and I know there are things in more acts, and 5 acts comes to mind, but I feel like a trilogy seems really common, and it has a natural arc where you have this first book setting everything up, the second one building on everything and dealing with stuff, and then the third one bringing a nice conclusion to it. It seems like it's really difficult to do more than that. And a series of 7, it's just so much time. The author has changed. There may be some burnout involved. It seems really difficult to have 7 books where everything is of equal level and everything is executed really well.
Yeah, we'll just have to see. We'll have to see. And with listeners, you always, as we're going through this season, we'd love to hear from you. What other series of books do you think end really well, have a nice strong ending there? It's hard for me to think of. There's a lot of series I haven't finished. Like
right. That's the other problem
and series that
we've started a lot of series.
I read Dune and Dune Messiah. I don't think I'll ever go past those two. I thought they were both fine. I enjoyed them both.
That was another one I was thinking of.
I'm not going to keep going.
The consensus I kind of hear is the first three are definitely worth reading. If you're going to read more than Dune, definitely read the first three. But then I've heard just skip 4 and 5, definitely skip 6, and then skip anything written by a different author. So that series was continued by his son.
Yeah, I will say another one I just thought of, obviously, and it's funny we haven't thought of this yet. I would definitely say that Hideous Strength is a really strong ending to the Ransom trilogy. It's obviously very different, very weird, and in many ways, and we're going to talk about some of the Orwellian parts of both that Hideous Strength and of The Last Battle itself. And Lewis does make some connections between what he's doing and what George Orwell is also doing, writing around the same time. And that Hideous Strength takes a lot of those themes and literary devices that Lewis used and ends that really well. The narrative, it's hard to follow a strong, clear line. I think that's part of what Lewis is doing. But Out of the Silent Planet and Paralandra do feel obviously very different than that Hideous Strength. I've gone on record saying I love that Hideous Strength. One of my favorite books by Lewis. I think it's his most underrated book. Not enough people talk about it. It speaks to the time that we live in more than any of his other books do right now, in my opinion. And so I guess that's a really great, strong ending. But again, it feels so incredibly disconnected from the first two, and from a narrative sense, that it's hard to even think of it as an ending to that series.
Yeah. When you were speaking about a science fiction book, that made me think of Octavia Butler's. It's now published under Lilith's Brood, but originally it came out as the Xenogenesis trilogy.
Yeah, you've been reading those, right?
Yeah, that one was a very well done trilogy, and I feel like that one ended very well.
Okay.
And I'm curious to read. She has another series that I believe has, I think the Patternist novels are 4 total. And I'd be curious to see what that one is like. Because that's a more uncommon number, I feel like.
I'll also say here, just as a final one here, my son has recently really been into Dr. Seuss. And The Cat in the Hat Comes Back. Pretty great sequel.
Yeah.
And I believe there's only 2. It's a duology. Great ending. That one's well done too. So props to Dr. Seuss, for ending that duology well. Well, that's I think it's time for us, Phil, to actually talk about this chapter itself.
All right, let's dive in.
One of the things we do for any new listeners is with each chapter, in case you're not reading right along with us, we have a chapter summary we do. 150 words or less. I do the odd chapters, and Phil does the even chapters. And so because this is chapter 1, I will read our summary. In the last days of Narnia, an ape named Shift and a donkey named Puzzle stumble upon a lion's skin in the middle of Cauldron Pool. Shift and Puzzle can hardly be called friends, for Shift demeans and controls Puzzle with his words. Puzzle, who is not very clever, is convinced to retrieve the skin for Shift. The ape sews the skin into a size that will fit Puzzle and manipulates the donkey into wearing the lion's costume. Shift, lusting for power and domination, realizes that a false Aslan, that is Puzzle in the lion's skin, could easily fool the talking beasts and provide him with control over them. Puzzle begrudgingly follows Shift's new plan. He will pretend to be Aslan, and Shift will tell him what to say.
Well done.
Some takeaways here. We have a chapter with completely new characters. The only time, I guess this actually has happened in the last 3 books, because I was going to say the only time this happened is just right now. Nope, actually it happened with Horse and His Boy and with Magician's Nephew. So for the 3rd book in a row, you're introduced to new characters. What are some of your first thoughts here? Puzzle and Shift.
This could be for many reasons. For some reason, though, I feel like I was immediately drawn into this story and I knew these characters pretty well. Just very succinct, lots of information about each one. They have very clear, distinct personalities, some big differences in how they talk and how they act, and the dynamic between the two is established very quickly. You understand that this ape is in charge and this poor donkey just falls for this stuff all the time.
Absolutely. And, there's often in our culture, we kind of throw the word toxic around a lot. I sent you that article in The Atlantic just a few weeks ago. That it's become a word that unfortunately has been overused. But this is a textbook definition of a toxic relationship right here. The way that Shift demeans and manipulates Puzzle. He preys upon Puzzle's lack of cleverness, as Lewis writes it that way. And Puzzle just falls for it all the time. Shift uses reverse psychology. He'll say things in ways that Puzzle kind of doesn't really understand the way he's saying things. I think it's just this really terrible relationship that's completely one-sided, right? Shift is, he's more like a servant. I think Lewis even uses that word when we get to this first paragraph. A couple of things I wanted to mention before we jumped into the chapter here is kind of just thinking about our setting here. The book opens up by telling us these are the last days of Narnia. It literally says that. In the last days of Narnia are the first words in this book. And I did a little bit of digging to try to find out when exactly this is happening when it comes to the actual, world of Narnia. And as we've said many times on this show before, Lewis has never been one who cares much about consistent world building, but nerds on the internet do care. And so
before you tell me, do you feel like it's established in the book itself?
I think that Lewis has done a better job establishing it than with other books, but no, not at all. Okay. Like not there's not a strong. I can start putting some things together later on in this book when Tyrion will acknowledge. Obviously, he's a descendant of Caspian. We know that just because of the fact that he's king.
It's in IAN.
Oh, that's why. Yeah, that's true too. Or I should say a descendant of Rilian, who was the last king that we had seen in the Silver Chair. But, it's not exactly clear. Some of it, I'll say, I'm just trying not to spoil you at all. It does become a little bit more clear as we go on, but not clear enough as to what I found on the internet.
Okay.
So what I've looked up, and some of this might come from, someone like Paul Ford, who did a lot of work here, but also there's a level of estimation that's occurring here. It says that the novel is set 200 years after the Silver Chair. So the last, in chronological order, the last time we were in Narnia was the Silver Chair. Caspian had died, Rilian had been crowned king, and now 200 years later is where we're at. This is about 2,500 years since the creation of our world, or about 50 years. So, sorry, the creation of Narnia itself. So from Aslan singing Narnia into existence to these last days, it's about 2,500 years.
Okay.
And on Earth, it's been about 50-ish years since Diggory and Polly. So we would assume Diggory and Polly are about 60 years old. They're about 10-ish in Magician's Nephew. Now they're about 60-ish.
It's pretty fast math.
Yeah. So I teach it for a living. That's why they pay me. You got to add those big numbers up in my head. So I just thought
it comes in handy with your salary.
Yeah. I just thought it was interesting just to think about the fact that Narnia lasts here for 2,500 years.
Yeah.
All right, so that's the setting, but before we even get to Cauldron Pool, we should at least acknowledge the fact that we are reading Narnia's Eschaton.
Oh, that gives us a chance to speak about our sponsor, Eschaton, which is a Peloton for stairs. What is an Eschaton?
Well done, sir. Well
I put
done.
my Eschaton in the upper echelon of the house.
All right. Well, the Eschaton is the final event in the world, right? It's a theological term, right? We might hear it more often with eschatology being the theological study of the end of the world. Yeah. But the Eschaton itself is the final event, right? Okay. And so, according to Scripture, there is an eschaton of some kind for our world. Our world will eventually end, whether that's tomorrow before the season airs or whether it's 50,000 years from now. The Bible actually tells us Jesus doesn't even know, right? That's in the Gospels. But Narnia has an eschaton, and it's not unknown to us. We're going to find out about it in this very book. I think that one thing I just want to mention, because we haven't actually talked about it much since the first few books, is that Lewis is obviously writing a supposal here. While you and I will spend, every other week, we'll spend about an hour discussing and enjoying these 8-page chapters for 8-year-olds, we do want to remember that this is not some kind of allegory. Lewis is not trying to reveal to us what his beliefs are, what his eschatological beliefs are, right? He's instead writing a fairy story for children. And you and I are going to dive into it. I'm going to read a significant portion of the Gospel from St. Matthew chapter 24 here, but we're also remembering that it doesn't mean he's actually saying this is exactly how I think the world's going to end.
Right. He is pulling inspiration and pieces from other stuff.
Yes.
But he is not doing a one-to-one.
Yeah. We're not going to sit down here and get into the nitty-gritty of, was he an amillennialist? Is he a dispensationalist? We're not. So if there are podcasts out there, if you want to do that, go check those out. They're great too. That's not this podcast.
Yeah, just
right
look
here.
up onomatopoeist.
All right, well, let's talk about the beginning of this chapter here. Puzzle and Shift in Cauldron Pool, this horrible relationship between the two of them. They come across this lion skin here in the bubbling water of Cauldron Pool. And Shift, using that kind of manipulative speech, is able to convince Puzzle to go and grab it. We even get insight here into the fact that Lewis even tells us, actually, it was just shot by some kind of hunter, and it's there. From the get-go, Phil, are you able to see, oh my goodness, this is already a fake Aslan, before you even got to the end of this chapter? Are you recognizing that? Again, that sounds like I'm saying it in a condescending way. I just don't know when that's occurring to someone reading it for the first time.
I did have a little bit of a heads up that someone was going to pretend to be Aslan.
Mm-hmm.
I did not know that it was going to be a donkey in lion's clothing.
Yeah.
I thought that my guess was there had been another lion before. I thought maybe another lion was pretending. But as soon as I read this, I thought this must be what people have been talking about.
And this idea, which it really is, was this Antichrist, right, here at the end of Narnia, this fake Aslan, is, again, a supposition of what that would be like. This is not at all about like what the book of Revelation says or what we hear in some of the Gospels when Jesus does talk about the end times. We have this complicated thing happening in this relationship where Puzzle is dressing up, but he's not really doing a lot of it out of his own volition. It's mostly through Shift. We're going to have some really interesting conversations later this season about like how culpable is Puzzle in all of this? Like how guilty is he? It is still his actions here doing this, but he's clearly doing it through the persuasion of someone who's very demeaning to him as well too. I wanted to read a little bit about some of their conversation that they have here, especially because of the way that it connects to some of Lewis's other writing and what he might be saying about relativism, modernity, and the end times. So on just the second page of the book, Puzzle and Shift see this thing, before they know it's a lion skin, lying in the water, and Shift asks Puzzle to go in and grab it. And this is how Puzzle responds. "Hop into the pool," said Puzzle, twitching his long ears.
"Well, how are we to get it if you don't?"
said the ape. But, said Puzzle, wouldn't it be better if you went in? Because you see, it's you who wants to know what it is, and I don't much. You've got hands, you see. You're as good as a man or a dwarf. When it comes to catching hold of things, I've only got hoofs.
"Really, Puzzle?"
said Shift.
"I didn't think you'd ever say a thing like that. Oh, I didn't think it of you, really."
"Why? What have I said wrong?" said the ass, speaking in a rather humble voice, for he saw that Shift was deeply offended. "All I meant was—"
"Wanting me to go into the water?" said the ape. "As if you don't know perfectly well what weak chests apes always have, and how easy they can catch cold. Very well, I will go in. I'm feeling cold enough already in this cruel wind. But I'll go in. If I go in, I should probably die. Then you'll be sorry."
And Shift's voice sounded as if he was going to burst into tears. Perfect encapsulation of their relationship right here.
It sure is. Just that little segment is enough to know everything you need to know about their relationship. He is obviously smarter, and he is using that to get what he wants without having to do very much work.
Exactly. And the one line that stuck out to me here was the ape, Shift here, acknowledging that he has a weak chest. Now, in the story here, he's meant about breathing, right? About swimming and these things. But I think most people who have read Lewis are familiar with this phrase, this idea of weak chests. This comes from Men Without Chests, which is the very beginning of the abolition of man. Obviously, the abolition of man is something that you and I have mentioned before on this show. it is Lewis's. In many ways, it's to a lot of people, it's become this kind of defense for a kind of non-relativistic, non-modern form of education or belief in kind of universal law. In fact, the first sentence from, I love it. I should get it like framed and hung in my classroom, but the first sentence from The Abolition of Man is, I doubt whether we are sufficiently attentive to the importance of elementary textbooks, right? And it's Lewis taking this, what he calls the Green Book, and looking through, which is very much this book arguing for relativism, especially in education, obviously.
Which is E equals MC squared.
Oh, that's right. And and saying that this is like a terrible way to raise, the next generation of people. And I wanted to read a little bit about it because I think that what we're seeing in Schiff saying, I have a weak chest, is actually very similar to what Lewis is saying is the problem with modernity. As we've talked a lot throughout this podcast about Lewis's writing often pushing back against modern thought in search of something greater and larger and more transcendent, right? So here's what Lewis says, and I've taken actually two quotes and kind of pushed them together here, but this comes from The Abolition of Man. The operation of the Green Book, which is that elementary book I just mentioned talking about relativism, and its kind is to produce what we call men without chests. It is an outrage that they should be commonly spoken of as intellectuals. This gives them the chance to say that he who attacks them attacks intelligence. It is not so. It is not excess of thought, but defect of fertile and generous emotion that marks them out. Their heads are no bigger than the ordinary. It is the atrophy of the chest beneath that makes them seem so. And all the time, such is the tragic comedy of our situation, we continue to clamor for those very qualities we are rendering impossible. You can hardly open a periodical without coming across the statement that what our civilization needs is more drive, or dynamism, or self-sacrifice, or creativity. In a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and yet demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor, and we are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful.
Wow.
So we build up man's intellect and knowledge. We remove education of the soul. I'm not talking about just, education like school education. I'm talking like the training or growing, or maybe I want to say forming of the heart and soul, just to the detriment of only focusing on intellect and knowledge. And then we're surprised by what these adults turn into. Right? We haven't cultivated love and goodness and virtues in you as you're growing up. And yet we're surprised to find that when you grow up, you have none of these things. Yeah. That's the kind of person that this ape has turned into. This talking beast, right? Someone who is set apart by Aslan.
And very intelligent.
Very intelligent, has turned into something that's lesser than a human, an ape, right? Yeah. Lewis even making a little joke there of kind of this, maybe he's making a little bit of a Darwinian joke here as it slides backwards, right? We see this ape who is highly intelligent, and yet there's no goodness that's apparent with him at all. That intelligence does not make him good. And I think Lewis is really trying to make that clear here. This antagonist of the story, whether he'll become our main antagonist or not, he's clearly the antagonist of this first chapter. And he's highly intelligent. Yeah. He's highly, maybe what we want to say in another word, highly educated, right? And yet here he is using all of that.
The ability to speak does not condone intelligence, and intelligence by itself does not mean that you're necessarily good.
I like that. That's well said. Yeah. Great reference from Qui-Gon Jinn as well, too. Well, this conversation between them continues, right? Now I got to close out The Abolition of Man here and open back up The Last Battle on my Kindle. So this conversation goes on. I mentioned earlier that Lewis tells us that it was a hunter that killed this lion. It was not a talking lion. It was just a dumb beast. And yet Puzzle, despite his lack of cleverness here, makes a good point in saying that, well, despite the fact that it's a lion, it doesn't seem quite right to just take the skin and do something silly with it. In fact, shouldn't we, bury the lion or something, simply because of the fact that, well, Aslan himself is a lion. So isn't there some kind of level of reverence that we are owed to the ape? Even if we don't believe it was a talking beast, shouldn't we give it some level of reverence? And Shift's response to that is, what are you talking about?
Right. And he has his heart in a really good place, even if he's not able to explain all the steps needed to get to how he arrived at that decision. I also love how Puzzle says "ee-ah-oo" in kind of donkey speak, but it also comes across as hemming and hawing.
And it's actually is in this moment that Shift kind of sends. You get a sense that this line of questioning is actually frightful to Shift. It's unclear whether or not Shift believes in Aslan or not, at least right here in chapter 1. It's not clear to us whether he does believe in Aslan and thinks, hey, we can do it, or if he's just using, let's say, religion, if you will, if he's using that to control others. Because in many ways, he is using the fear, and he will by the end of this chapter, he's using the donkey's fear of Aslan to manipulate him. I mean, wow, what a... That as much as this is a supposal, that could just be pure up allegory right there, right? How often, unfortunately, have we seen that happen, where religion has been used to manipulate others, often by a leader who doesn't even believe themselves. It's just like, right. I know that this is kind of a way that I can dupe people or control others, yep. Right?
I feel like we've seen that a ton in the past 100 years, especially just because that's one of the most recorded times. But whenever I hear someone with a very serious complaint, it usually goes back to a person who is pretending to follow Christ or pretending to be a leader and then just abusing that dynamic.
And in some ways, this is kind of the difference between what Lewis was facing in modernity and what you and I face in post-modernity, is that, the world of Oxford here in the time that, maybe not as much in the 50s, but let's go even back to the 30s when the Inklings are really meeting up, is most certainly not a pro-Christian environment. But from everything I've read over the years, it's not necessarily an anti-Christian environment, right? You don't have, you have someone like Tolkien who's very religious, obviously very involved in his Catholic parish, who's obviously very big at a secular university like Oxford, who's a very becoming a famous writer, not that famous in the 30s yet, because not to the end that The Hobbit's published, but he's still very... The Hobbit is published. Well, look, it's the new season. I got to mispronounce something, okay? That's how we do here. But he's very well respected as an academic. And I think that what we find in the beginning of the 20th century, as modernity is kind of taking hold, is, hey, your religion is great. We'll even have some respect and reverence for it, but don't kind of push it in my face. Like, we all, like all the religion. This is where all the religions can all coexist perfectly, and they all kind of lead to the same place. So if that's what you want to do, that's great for you. And what we start to see a little bit near the end of the 20th. So and to your point too, Josh, I should say, is, if there's an issue with religion, it's more of religious leaders themselves. Like, my issue isn't with Jesus himself. My issue is with the people who follow Jesus. My issue is the people who preach the gospel of Jesus but are hypocritical and do this thing. And so,
I like your Christ, but I don't like your Christians. They're so unlike your Christ.
Yeah, is that Gandhi?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that makes sense for this time period, right? And so as you go on, though, later on, as we get through post-modernity, there is, I think, a little bit more of an attack on the institution itself and not just the people, like the individuals. There's more of a, no. Actually, what we're starting to see, this is speaking from a postmodern perspective. I'm sure there's postmodernists who would disagree with me. Email the show, thenarniapodcast@gmail.com. I think often what we see, though, at the latter end of the 20th century, into the 21st century, is, we used to be critical just of these ministers, just these leaders themselves, but actually, what if it's corrupt from its very core? And actually, we can't trust Christ, or we can't trust religion as even an institution, because it's corrupted so many people that actually, at its core, it must be an inherently bad thing. And while there were people believing this at the beginning of the 20th century, I don't know that Lewis was encountering that necessarily as much as you and I are now, where it's not just, hey, I've got issues with this section of the church, or maybe the church's power or influence here. It's no, my problem is just the church as it exists at all. I don't want it to exist at all. And I think, and again, that's not even just Christianity here in the West. That it could be, Judaism, Islam, just organized religion in general. And I think that's some of what we're seeing in Shift here, is someone who is taking the good news of Aslan, right?
And twisting it
in horrific ways, right? Yeah. And so it's not surprising to us, unfortunately, when we see people kind of turn and say, well, how can I, Gandhi's words, instead of sitting there and going, wow, how arrogant of Gandhi. They should cut us to the heart in many ways and say, wow, like, what does that mean? Like, why has our witness often been hurt by ourselves often?
Right. And further complicated by the fact that we are still broken. It's the whole reason that Christ died for us is because we can't do this on our own. And just because we believe in Christ and want to do better, as we see even from Paul's life was completely changed, and he still struggled with so many things.
That's well said. So back to chapter here, they meet back up together after Schiff has sewed this costume together. And costume actually does feel like the appropriate word here because it is so silly, right? And he puts it onto the donkey here. And with Lewis's line about, hey, he sounds like a lion as long as he doesn't bray, there's a pretty clear reference throughout all this chapter, but especially here, to a really famous fable, one of Aesop's fables, The Ass and the Lion's Skin. Are you familiar with this one?
I'm not. I was thinking more a wolf in sheep's clothing.
It's similar. Yeah. I actually found a nice short little 3-paragraph summary of the fable that I'd like to read to you, if that's all right.
Let's hear it.
I'm pretty sure that Aesop is out of... is in the public domain, so I think we should be safe.
Yes.
it's that we got thousands of years, right? So here it is. An ass found a lion's skin left in the forest by a hunter. He dressed himself in it and amused himself by hiding in a thicket and rushing out suddenly at the animals who passed that way. All took to their heels the moment they saw him. Now the ass was so pleased to see the animals running away from him, just as if he were King Lion himself, that he could not keep from expressing his delight by a loud, harsh bray. A fox, who ran with the rest, stopped short as soon as he heard the voice. Approaching the ass, he said with a laugh, "If you had only kept your mouth shut, you might have frightened me too. But you gave yourself away with that silly bray." And a lot of the Aesop fables have a little one sentence like, "Here's the moral: a fool may deceive by his dress and appearance, but his words will soon show what he really is."
Yes.
Very clearly, and we see some of this in some of the very early Roman writers. This story comes around, I want to say, I'm not sure what century, but this is something Lewis would have been very familiar with from his academic work, a story like this. And when you hear this, you go, oh, this is very clearly Lewis is pulling on this for this chapter here.
Not even a supposal, it's just a one-to-one.
Yeah, no, just a one-to-one for the most part, right? Well, as this chapter comes to an end, because really it's mostly just dialogue here, which we don't need to work through one at a time, we do find out that Puzzle is actually really not feeling good about this. In fact, when Schiff tells him the plan, which is, hey, we could use this to our advantage. We could gain a lot of power if we say that Aslan is telling people to do certain things, and we could pretend you're Aslan. Puzzle responds with, no, no, no. He said that would be wrong. Right? And it doesn't seem necessarily that he believes it's wrong just for the sake of the universality of the moral that, hey, it's wrong to impersonate God, right? But even just, hey, it'd be wrong because what if the real Aslan turned up? Like, we'd be in a lot of trouble. There is a appropriate fear of Aslan, right?
Right.
And Schiff responds like this.
"I'd expect he'd be very pleased,"
said Schiff.
"Probably he sent us the lion's skin on purpose so that we could set things to rights. Anyway, he never does turn up, not nowadays."
Now at that moment, there came a great thunderclap right overhead, and the ground trembled with a small earthquake. But the animals lost their balance. Both the animals lost their balance and were flung on their faces. "Oh, there!" gasped Puzzle as soon as he had breath to speak. "Oh, it's a sign, a warning. I knew we were doing something dreadfully wicked. Take this wretched skin off me at once."
No,
said the ape, whose mind worked very quickly.
"It's a sign the other way. I was just going to say that if the real Aslan, as you called him, meant for us to do this, he would send us a thunderclap and an earth tremor."
What a great, in an incredibly evil way, what a great quick flip. You just take everything that someone is interpreting the correct way and spin it just a little bit and put it back the other way. Yes, it is a sign, but it's a sign the other way.
Exactly. And again, that just shows you the way. I mean, Schiff's name and Puzzle's name, I guess we should talk about both of these here. I mean, Schiff really, he's shifty. That's what he is, right? Yeah. That's exactly what he is. While Puzzle is literally just puzzled all the time, right? Their names are very much tell us who they are as characters. And Puzzle, obviously, as you can get a hint from, and as the book goes along, Puzzle's going to go along with this, right? Puzzles, despite his, misgivings about what might happen, he still follows Shift along here. And that's how the chapter ends. The chapter ends with this plan about to go into action here, which is that, hey, we are going to dress you up as a lion. We're going to march you around and tell people that Aslan has returned, and we'll tell them what Aslan wants people to do.
Yes. And within seconds, there's already the thunderclap, but it really has just set up. Things can't go well. There's no good can come of this.
Yes. And that's the end of the chapter, Phil. Any final thoughts before we look forward to chapter 2 and finish with a little bit of listener feedback?
I really enjoyed how this one started with 2 animals instead of 2 children at school. And I know that they're not all going to start the same way, but this one felt really different to me.
I mean, this is the first chapter with no boys and girls in it at all,
right? In
the Chronicles.
Yeah.
The first time we've had a chapter that starts a book, not a little boy, no little girl, just a monkey and a donkey.
Right.
So, Phil, before we move on to look at our next chapter and listener feedback, there was one final thing I wanted to do, which didn't really fit into the chapter itself, but I think now that this plan is being put into motion, it feels appropriate. And that's to actually look at Scripture itself. Walter Hooper pointed to Matthew and Mark and Luke, as well as Daniel and Revelation, those 5 books of the Bible, for some pretty significant places where some of this supposition might come from Lewis. And, many of our listeners are familiar with the Bible, but some of them aren't. And so I thought actually reading through some of Matthew 24 here would be helpful for us. And I think, Phil, you have that.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and read it then and hear what the Gospel of St. Matthew has to say and how it might be related to what's to come.
This is Matthew 24. We'll read about the first 30 or so. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures the end will be saved. And this gospel to the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here's the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, 'Look, he is in the wilderness,' do not go out. If they say, 'Look, he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the power of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming out of the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other.
Thank you. I know that's a lot, but
that's all my reading for the
that's that you're done
for the season.
It's a lot that's going on there, and we're not going to sit here and try to, and especially if listeners are not familiar with reading the Bible or with hearing some of that language and being like, wow, that's really apocalyptic there. It also is important to remember that just a few verses down, Jesus says, I don't even know when that's going to happen. So like there have been a lot of Christians, unfortunately, throughout time who have sat around and said, well, we do know when Jesus is coming back, it's coming here, here, and here. Or then, oh, no, wait, I was wrong. I was off on one, but this year, it's actually next year instead. Right. The Bible is extremely clear. Jesus himself, let me find it. It's verse 36. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only.
Right. That's a pretty good way to tell that someone doesn't know when it's going to be.
Exactly.
Is when they say that it's going to be. You can almost bet that it's not going to be right then.
You also can just bet that someone saying it is not familiar with Scripture at all because that we don't know. We just don't know. And I'm sure that there are, a lot of times we'll see people, you'll see somebody on the internet or something be like, well, this is happening right now in this part of the world, or this is happening, or COVID came, or so all this other things. And it's always helpful for me as someone who taught medieval history for quite a few years to be like, the Black Plague had to have felt like the actual end times, or the sack of Rome or the sack of Constantinople had to feel in some ways like the end, and none of those things were. And so trying to, like, in our current moment, trying to actually determine when the actual end of the world is very foolish, honestly. It's not even silly. It's foolhardy. It's not something that should happen. So in case some of our listeners who are not familiar maybe with Christian theology or with eschatology, they hear that like, wow, that's stressful. It's actually not, because
we have nations rising up against nations right now.
Yeah, exactly. So, but let's take out some of the lines here. So, you've got in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. We also see Jesus say, there will be many who come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. I mean, but that's literally chapter 1 right here.
Yeah.
That's chapter 1 of the last battle. There's people coming in my name saying, I am the Christ, or I am Aslan. They are attempting to lead people astray. You'll see this in the next chapter. There's going to, just in verse 6, you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars, right? Nation rises up against nation. There'll be famines, earthquakes in various places. Just the beginning of the birth pains, right? Beginning of the pains.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening in this story. And what we see here, and again, Phil, I know you haven't read this. I know some of our listeners actually follow along with us, and maybe they haven't read it too. But this is not a story where things get better. In fact, they're going to consistently just get worse. And every single time that you go, oh, this is that time of the last 6 books where Lewis has this happen, or this is where this little catastrophe is going to occur, throughout this book, we're going to see instead the exact opposite happen. Or, oh, no, it is just an actual catastrophe. The end of the world is not a pleasant thing, and this is the actual end of Narnia. Yeah. And so I think even not knowing exactly how it's going to end or what happens near the end, it shouldn't surprise any of us that you're going to have people who don't respond super positively to this book because it is about the end times, Yeah. And not because they're like, well, I don't like Lewis's theology. I mean, I'm sure maybe some don't, but it has more to do with the fact of we as humans are deeply, deeply uncomfortable with the idea of endings.
Yes.
The idea of death, the idea of destruction, right? And in many ways, that's a good thing. You and I don't live with rampant death around us. And right. We live in a very privileged environment right here in America where, we just don't have, we even live in a time in, as far as, chronologically, where think about how low, we talked about this just a few chapters ago, the infant mortality rate is, right? I think, didn't we? I don't know when that came up because I remember saying the infant mortality rate went up and you're like, no, you want it to go down. I was like, yes, I don't remember why we were talking about it, but we did talk about it. right? And so because of that, we have this disconnect from death, or at least I do. I shouldn't speak for everybody. I have a disconnect from death that I know that my ancestors often didn't. Right. Death feels incredibly distant. It feels something that doesn't happen, right? And in our culture, we're deeply uncomfortable with it. I'm deeply uncomfortable with it.
And look at the movies that we like, just as a culture in general. We like happy endings. Mm-hmm. And some of the ones that shock us the most are the ones that don't end well. And I'm thinking specifically of in the Marvel kind of Infinity War saga. Infinity War ends in this just terrible, surprising way where we don't win. And even that, they make another movie so that we do win.
Yeah.
We're very uncomfortable with loss in general. Just things have been getting so much better for so long. I feel like it's really anti to what our experience is.
And I think it's important just to keep that in mind as we walk through this book. Walter Hooper writes this in Past Watchful Dragons. He says, Lewis's didactic purpose ought to be clear to those who are conversant with Orthodox Christianity. And that's lower O, Orthodox Christianity.
Define didactic too, because I feel like that one's a...
Logical. Yeah. It should, his logical purpose here is
also in a manner designed to teach, right?
Yes, correct too. Yeah. He uses his own invented world to illustrate what the church has been teaching since the beginning, but which is becoming more and more neglected or forgotten. Namely, that this world will come to an end. It was never meant to be our real home. That lies elsewhere. We do not know, we cannot possibly know when the end will come, and the end will come not from within, but from without. I think that idea that, we as a culture have become increasingly more and more forgetful of the fact that death is all around us. The end is all around us. And so I think that we kind of hear what you and I were trying to say. We hear Walter Hooper write much more succinctly and simply than you and I trying to work it out on our own. We hear this idea of maybe what we should be looking for as we move our way through this book right now.
Right.
It's a pretty dour note to end on, but
that's what the end times are like.
That seems appropriate for the last battle here. Well, Phil, we'll be back in 2 weeks with the last battle, chapter 2, the rashness of the king.
So now, it sounds like someone's clothes got damp. They weren't able to dry them off.
So I was gonna ask. I said that I would give you the chapter title each week and ask you to kind of help plan out what's going to happen. What do you think the king might have done that is so rash?
Well, I think it's going to be important to take this from a dermatological point of view.
So you're gonna
not go more than skin deep.
So you refuse to answer. You said, I think it is just he's going to get a bad rash here. Maybe you could take this somewhere. Let's work with it. Mm-hmm. A disease breaks out throughout Narnia.
Sure.
A skin rash.
Yeah, maybe a plague.
Exactly.
Maybe there's some locusts. I believe there's going to be a king, so we'll get to know a king, and he is going to do something probably unkingly. He is going to make a decision, and it is going to have some consequences for the next 15 chapters. That's my guess.
Okay. That's a great thought there. Well, before we go, Phil, we actually have a voicemail. Oh, and actually, I'm wrong. We're doing a voicemail in our next episode. Today, we have kind of a short little email here. It's from Andres, who has written to us before, and it actually is entitled Expired URL. So this is a different little bit of listener feedback, but I promise it has a purpose here. Then Andreas sent us this email, and we really appreciate this. He says, I'm starting to listen to season 6 of your podcast, At Last Catching Up, and I enjoyed so much Holly's email that you read in the listener feedback section of episode 1, because I've always wondered about your real appearance. The sad part was when I clicked on the link to see the pictures, it turned out to be expired. That was disappointing. Could you please fix the link for us, your curious listeners, so that we can see those photos of you? Thanks. Greetings from Chile as well, too, from Andres. And the reason I wanted to pick this email is because here, 5 years into the show, 7 seasons later, we can finally share that we have a website.
That's right.
Lamppostlistener.com, all one word, lamppostlistener. Someone else had already had the. So
Do we really have that?
Yeah, we have lamppostlistener.com.
Oh,
Did you know that? Yeah,
no,
we got it.
I didn't know you bought it. I thought it was still using the.
Thank you, Patreon, lamppostlistener.com.
Sweet.
And there you can see there is a little web page about us as the host with a little picture. Is it lamppost with the dash? No dash.
No dash. Okay.
LAMPPOSTLISTENER.com.
Sweet.
And I asked Phil's mother, I was like, do you have a really embarrassing picture of Phil that I could put up there? My picture looks great.
I was just telling someone about this today because I had seen the preview of the site.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, so I have practiced photography for years and I've taken all these pictures of Daniel. And are you using your professional headshot?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Daniel puts together the website and he looks great. He's dressed to the nines. He's got his glasses on, which implies that he reads a lot.
That's why I have him. Yep.
And then my picture is kind of, it almost looks like you pulled your phone out and took the photo while you were still moving your arm. It's a little bit blurry. My beard's unkempt. I'm hunched over. I'm wearing like secondhand clothing, and I'm just looking at the computer, not even looking at the camera. So hopefully that's been fixed by this time. But you can see what we look like, and that is what I look like
as well. And
in the dark at in my office.
And in my defense, I pulled both the pictures from our LinkedIn profiles. That's like the only social media you and I really use.
That's a different photo. I mean further down.
Further down. I don't know what it is further down that you're talking about. I'll have to look. It won't be there anymore.
It's one where we're recording in the office. And
yeah, that one. Okay, that's fair. That's the only picture I had of you recording the show. So I thought it'd be fun. I was like, we should put a couple pictures of us recording. Now that we sit on our couches, we have a good time, we're relaxed and stuff. But usually our wives are gone when we're recording, so no one's here to take pictures of us. So at some point, either Sarah Jane or Anna will need to just like snap a quick picture so people can see what it actually looks like. So we have a picture
of both of us. Yes.
But there on the website, you probably don't really care that much about what we look like. It is there, short little bios. But we also have all the books we've ever mentioned on the podcast. We have links to purchase those if you want to check those out.
I will say this. You put a ton of work into that website.
Yeah.
And it's really nice to have it all together. Thanks for doing
that. We
have
links to all the episodes. If you're like, I remember, so-and-so guest that did this thing. Well, we have a list of all of our guests and the episode that you can find them in. So anyone who's ever had their voice on our show is there. You can find them. You can find links to their works if you want to purchase more of their works, even stuff that we didn't mention on the show. Though actually, we just wanted to mention that there. There's also links, obviously, to our Patreon, to YouTube, all those other things too. But it's hopefully going to be a little bit of a resource for people now that we've got over 100 episodes and 6 seasons worth of work here. So Andreas, you can find the links even to those pictures there at the website, lamppostlistener.com.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we should have some more photos because we're recording this right before we're going to a conference.
We are, yes.
So we will have attended it by the time this episode comes out. But
it'll been months since we've attended. Yes. By then, we are going in the end of January. We're going to be headed off down to Charleston, South Carolina, going to the Mere Anglicanism Conference. It is entitled "Telling a More Beautiful Story: Lessons from C.S. Lewis on Reaching a Fractured World." I'm not going to talk too much about it because at this point, you and I probably recorded episodes in Charleston and released them. So people probably know more about the conference than you and I do at this moment.
That's right.
Time travel is weird.
Yeah. Just another argument for why not everything needs to be in chronological order.
All right, Phil, any final thoughts here? And so again, also, Andres, thank you for letting us know that link was broken, and it's also fixed. I went back and fixed it in the episode as well, too, for people to click on it there. But then also check out the website. Any final thoughts, Phil?
Speaking of other content besides just this podcast, we do have a Patreon. And it starts as low as $2 a month, and that gets you access to a additional podcast that we do where we talk about things tangential to Narnia. And we also have different prizes at the $5 level. I'll mail you a sticker for this season and the past seasons. For the $25 a month level, I will make a piece of art that is exclusive to the people supporting us at that level.
Yeah,
and it's printed out real nice, and it's suitable for framing. We framed ours.
Yeah.
Because we support the show in a different way by making it. It also gets you access to our entire backlog of The Dancing Lawn, which is our podcast that we do exclusively for our patrons.
Yeah. Well, great. Thanks for the pitch there. That actually sounds like a perfect time for us to go into these little end credits we always do here. As always, this episode is made possible by those Patreons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, just like Phil mentioned, you can listen to a bonus episode each month. Special thanks goes out to John Marr, Emily Wakefield, and Ryan Smith for supporting us at our very top tiers. If you have any listener feedback, as always, you can email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com. We realize we have the domain name now for lamppostlistener.com, but we've recorded over 100 episodes of saying that email, so we're going to keep that email and just keep using that email for listener feedback. Although, Phil, if you want me to create phil@lamppostlistener.com, so you can make a business card, I think Google will make us pay them $6 annually. So if you want to support the show, no, I'll stop.
We need one more.
We need one more person on Patreon for that to be possible. You can also call us at 406-646-6733.
Which is Daniel's direct line.
You spoke over the numbers. They didn't hear it now. It is not my direct thing. To be clear, we just got this number from Google. I have no idea where that area code is. I wonder if we have any listeners in 406. I have no idea where that's at. Okay. But 406-646-6733. You can also find all of our previous episode links and book information at lamppostlistener.com. We'd appreciate a review over at Apple Podcasts or anywhere else where you find this podcast because it helps other listeners join along in our read-through. Thank you for coming along on this journey, and we will be back next time with Chapter 2.
See you very soon.